I was eyeing that burger. Had a bet with everybody here at the table that I'd be able to down it before I had to speak, but I was unsuccessful. So it is, Shirley and Harriet, thank you so much for the invitation to be here with you today. And if you're in the back and can't hear, just raise your hand because it's a pleasure. And I came to talk about my new book, and I just appreciate having that opportunity. It's available for sale afterwards too. It's $19 a book. Just a reminder that Christmas is right around the corner. So, you know, ideal gift giving things. And think about that while you're doing the speech. But I kind of wanted to give you an idea of what happened to bring about the writing of the book. And I start by telling people that I made a friend in a person by the name of Fred Bigler many years ago, 30 years ago, in Modesto. And Fred was a probation officer for the county of Stanislaus in Modesto. And no, I was not on probation. That's not I met him. But what was special about Fred was that he was a real student of the Bible, self-taught. But he also worked in a place where he was able to observe and try to help reprobates, people whose lives are destroyed, particularly young kids, could see very easily that they were going down a wrong road, had very little chance of being able to turn things around, and with his biblical knowledge, kind of developed an idea of how things should be, or were meant to be. And he shared it with me, and he said, you know, that if a person is properly related to the authority figures in 4 institutions of family, faith, work, and government, then that person has a strong foundation from which to live a good life. And so, in essence, for a child learns how to honor their mother and their father, learn how to work, obey the laws of the land, and maintain a clear conscience for God. That child will have a firm foundation in their life, and they're prepared to meet their future. Well, that began a 30-year journey for me to kind of figure out, well, if God established those institutions a long time ago, they ought to be important to us. They ought to be especially important to policymakers. We ought to know more about them. What were their purposes? Why were they created? How are they now? And if they're not the way we want them to be, what do we need to do to put them together? A few years later, I was elected to Congress, and so I took this idea with me. I was president of the freshman class when I got back, and when I got back in Washington, I used the example of a chair to illustrate this point, where you're sitting on a chair that has 4 legs. They're all strong, and they're both even in their influence to the design of the chair. That's why you're sitting comfortably. You're not worried about falling on the floor. And so I constructed a chair that looked just like the ones you're sitting in. Then I made a mock chair of how those institutions might be today. The government chair leg was longer than the other one. The family leg was short, and all the other ones proportionally, so that while it was standing, if you touched it with your finger, it'd knock over, and you sure as heck didn't want to be sitting on it. And we had a press conference in front of the Capitol. Newt Gingrich came out and pulled the chair to make a point that, you know, there's more to this life than government, and that there's other institutions that we need to be concerned about. And I approached Newton on this. This is brilliant. This is brilliant. You need to talk to Bob Dole, who was then in 1996 the presidential candidate. And so I took my ideas down to Bob Rumsfeld, who was Bob Dole's national campaign manager at the time, and kind of walked him through the idea that, you know, what we need to do is reduce government, but we need to rebuild families and you know, restore some of these responsibilities to the other institutions. And Bob was a good listener, and I spoke for a while, and when I was done, he looked at me and goes, you know, that's terrific. He said, but it ain't Bob Dole. And that was the end of that meeting. And so I shopped it around, and I thought, you know, I'm not getting anywhere with this thing, and I kind of tossed it in the shelf. And one of the conclusions that I came to was that charity somehow had a role to play in this, but I didn't quite know what. And, you know, the idea that if people were asked to give by a government figure, it was just not going to work. So I, out of frustration, kind of tossed it on the shelf. I picked it up a year or 2 later when I came across some new information about charitable giving. And I developed something called the 1% plan. And what I found out was that the stats of charity in the country. Historically, Americans give $300 billion a year to charity. And that's the sum total of what you and I deduct off our tax returns, and it amounts to $300 billion a year. It's about 1.5 to 2% of gross pay, cumulative gross pay. And I also found out that foundations and corporations give about $100 billion a year, which threw me a little bit. I thought those numbers would be opposite. But really the power of giving in this country is the individual. And I thought about it, and I thought, you know, if the national charitable giving rate is 1.5 to 2%, if it were raised to 3%, it would mean an additional $100 billion a year to churches and nonprofits. Imagine, you know, that's a significant number. Imagine the impact it would have on our culture. And so I put together with Lieberman and Santorum on the Senate side, and Henry Ford and I, a House resolution called the 1% Plan, basically illustrating all of that. And Republicans were gathered at a retreat in Greenbrier with then President Bush. It was before 9/11, it was right around 2000. And the Republican House and Senate and President Bush were there, and he was addressing the crowd. And took Q&A, and I raised my hand, and I said, Mr. President, and I laid out the facts. How do you know, 1.5 to 2% to 3% by 1%, you get an extra $100 billion. Don't you think, you know, you have the biggest bully pump in the land, don't you think that that would have an impact? And you could tell and look in his face that it was as clear as the bell, that he got it. But he said, you know, if you're asking me to tell Americans to give more, I'm afraid I can't do that. And he was right, because nobody wants to hear that from a politician. You know, the automatic response is, well, why don't you just cut my taxes so I can? So very understanding, but I met later with the House chaplain, and because I wanted to get the House chaplain support for this, Father Coughlin, and I said, Father, and I started explaining, he said, George, he said, I heard you. He said, I heard you before, I was at Greenbrier. The moment you were started talking about this, I thought, how can I help this kid? So Father Coughlin agreed to take, and this is a Catholic story, I'm a Catholic, not knocking Catholics, this is the same for every major religion. But he said, I want to take this to the Council of Bishops, which is in Washington, D.C. And he took it to him, and a couple weeks later it passed, and I've not heard from him. I said, Father, you know, what happened? And he said, well, they rejected it outright. And I said, why? And he said, because there was a little clause in there that talked about how if people were giving more to charity, the end result might be less government spending. And the Council of Bishops did not want 40% of Catholic charities is government money, and they didn't want to jeopardize their government funding by supporting the fact that people should be giving more. Now, I'd had it by then. I'd back on the shelf the idea. And then I was compelled about 3 years ago to pick it up again and finish it. And I had learned one more fact in the charity puzzle. And that is, you know, while I mentioned the $300 billion from individuals, $100 billion from corporations and nonprofits, there's another charity giver out there, and it's the 500-pound gorilla in the room, and it's called the United States federal government, who's using your tax dollars for charitable purposes. In the Bush budget, that's $800 billion a year. So 66% of the charity in this country is state-sponsored through your tax dollars. Almost 20% of the federal budget, 20 to 25 cents of your tax dollar goes to state-sponsored charity. Is there any other question about why we have a large dependency class in this country right now? So I thought, okay, those were the ideas. That is what compelled me to think seriously about, you know, what the reform was needed in this country. And so, in the end, what I did learn is that the four institutions that I speak of that need to be restored, which I call the New World Order, is what is known as the cultural mandate. That is, again, those institutions that were established in the garden. If you believe that, if people of faith, those of us that are believers, believe that those were established for God to be able to protect and provide things, blessings to us and protect us. In other words, it is the way for the faithful to pursue happiness. And the theory that I make in the book is that we have a constitutional right of access to every one of those four institutions. The constitutional right to a mother and a father, a constitutional right to education of our choice, a right to a government that protects us, and a right to the full and free exercise of religion. Now, if you believe that, it tells you a couple of things. And in fact, this is how I'm a firm believer in that this is God's charge for us, is to make this is kingdom building on earth, I believe, is those institutions so that every person has a right of access to those institutions. And what the federal government has grown to do in state-sponsored charity is deny people access to those institutions. You can only see the fifth generation welfare mom that there's never been a father in the home. That's a violation of the constitutional right for a child to have a mother and a father. And it also provides, I think, a guide for smaller government. If we in the private sector take back that role as being the provider of charity, you can cut the federal government by 20 to 25%. So I think understanding the four institutions really opens up a clue. One of the points that I make in the book is that in the free exercise of religion, I talk a little bit generally about things in Genesis. The only scripture that I quote is 2 Peter 1 through 5. And you know it by the charge of, add to your faith virtue, and add to virtue knowledge, and add to knowledge temperance, add to temperance godliness, add to godliness brotherly kindness, and add to brotherly kindness charity. That's a description of the free exercise of religion. And the first few from faith, and you know how the founding fathers talked about how a free democracy, free society cannot live without virtuous people. They understood it to mean because if you weren't, what I say is that the reason they said, and they may not have known that, was that it's the responsibility of that faith institution to foster virtue, which brings us to godliness, which is another word for saying independence, so that we're strong and then we're able to exercise brotherly kindness and charity. I call this a faith-building machine. Because when you're giving charity, you produce faith, and it's that voluntary giving of brotherly kindness and charity is what moves people from dependence to independence, and that is what it's really not. The power of the church is not in its voting pool. The power of this church and religion is its ability to persuade people. You know, Jesus didn't demand that there be laws to regulate behavior. He did it through love and persuaded people to that life. And that's what's missing, I think, in our country today. So, one of the things I quote is that the vertical relationship in the free exercise of religion is one that we all understand. What we don't understand is that we have a right to that horizontal exercise of religion, and that's charity, and the federal government's in violation of the free exercise of religious clause in the Constitution. So if you know all this, then what you need to know is that we need to restore charity in the church, and that needs to be used to rebuild the family. And if you want a plan to restore the United States, that's the plan. Along with that comes government protection. And so I have about 4 things that people need to do in order to restore the country. And I think that we're coming to the point now where socialism, humanistic ideas, the ideas of socialism are coming to an end. It wasn't because conservatives were able to amass a majority and cut government. It's because the old system is bankrupting this country, and we're not going to survive this way much longer. We can't. We're already in decline, and I think people know that. And so the 4 things that we need to do really need to start happening in the private sector. And the first thing is that we need to outclass government. We need to stop thinking that there's a role for government and you pay your taxes. Most of what frustrates me with my Republican colleagues, if you take, for example, the Paul Ryan budget, Paul's a sharp guy and knows what he's doing, but they're really only proposing spending less in every category in every area that government does already. And you're not going to restore this country that way. You have to kind of figure out decide amongst ourselves what government does not do anymore, and start acting on that. And so, it concerns me that they are not taking that approach. But what we need to do is basically outclass government, and that is come up with our own system of doing it better. and make it demonstrably large enough so that we've got an excuse to get government out. The second thing that we need to do is rekindle the independence building machine. That's the one that I talk about how faith leads to charity and then recycles itself again to bring more people from dependence to independence. And then we need to use that from the private sector to direct it toward rebuilding the family. There's another thing that we need to do as well once that system is set up in the private sector, and that is obtain standing in the courts. Because if you take back government programs, you want to reduce government by 20 to 25%, you're going to get a fight. And I quote Thurgood Marshall and tell the story of Thurgood Marshall, how when he, on the issue of school segregation, developed the long process of obtaining standing in the courts. And what they did was they got together and they identified court cases all across the country for their impact on society, so that they were ones that showed the abuse to children for the lack of segregation. And they began to target places to move up through the court system. Because what people will say is, George, that's impossible. You can't sue based on it's a violation. Say, for example, like the cigarette laws that were in court and won. People, you kind of got to take that approach where the fifth generation welfare mom, you can prove that by this being on a government dole that they've been denied access to these 4 other institutions, and it was a violation of the Second or the First Amendment. And so these are the things that the country needs to do in order to restore itself. What my fear is that once we start heading toward less government because we can't afford it anymore, that we'll either have a chance for anarchy or a plan of restoration. And what I think I'm offering and what I'm trying to lead is this plan of restoration. It really is a battle between humanism and the foreign institutions. And we can't rely on just a return to constitutional principles to set this country straight. Do any of you think that our culture is the same as it was with the founding fathers in 1776? And all you got to do is look at London and Europe to see that they're further down the slide than we are. And so what we need to do is put together a restoration plan for America. It starts with our culture. It doesn't start with Washington. Washington responds, and so that's kind of my 30-year assessment of how this country needs to be put back together, and based on what I've seen in Washington. So I'm dedicating myself to speaking about this, but also the possibility of starting a pilot project in Fresno. The idea of the private sector taking the social programs back from the government is a wild notion and needs a little more thought about how we do it with boots on the ground. And the bottom line is this: soon, if a Republican is serious about reducing government, then there are two classes of people that are at risk: the widow and the orphan, the elderly and the young. And the government cannot take care of both of those groups of people anymore. My theory is let the government maintain its commitment to the elderly because it was a contract that people base their lives on. It is the private sector that has to take back this next generation. And that's the job that we have to do in order to restore this country. Can't do it by law, can't do it by this or that. We have to do it ourselves. And so that's how you restore the country, and you'll find it all in that book over there. So that's what I learned in my 16 years in Washington. But it was wonderful serving there. But there's not a lit bulb in that town, and I'll tell you that right now. There's just people that don't understand. And the problem that I have with Republicans and Democrats is that both think that even Republicans, conservative Republicans, think if you just give me the majority that I'll fix it in Washington. It's not going to get fixed in Washington. So that's the frustration that I think that I experienced back there. But the good news is there is a plan out there, and hopefully I can get it into the national stage and move forward. So there you have it. And I'm very pleased to come and speak.